Welcome to the Unforgiving 60 with your hosts, Ben Pronk and Tim Curtis. As two ex-SAS guys armed with MBAs, Ben and Tim seek out people leading lives less ordinary and talk with them about how they fill their unforgiving minutes and what helps them go, always, a little further. Like intellectual bowerbirds, we aim to collect shiny little objects of knowledge that we think can help build better humans.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Unforgiving 60 podcast. I'm Ben Pronk.
And I'm Tim Curtis.
And Tim, we've had a few politicians on the show. We've had Jackie Lambie, we've had the two Andrews, and always had really interesting chats with them. And that's why I'm especially looking forward to today's guest, Senator David Van. Now, David Van, in addition, or as part of his impressive political career, has recently drawn a lot of attention for his support for the conflict in the Ukraine, including his visits there. And so we're going to explore what the conflict means to him, what it potentially means to Australia and our region, and what he's learnt from his time both in politics but more particularly in his support for and his visits to the Ukraine. So particularly looking forward to that conversation.
Let's get on with the show. Well, welcome to the Unforgiving 60 podcast. I'm Tim Curtis, as always, with my co-host, Ben Pronk.
How are you, Tim?
I'm very well. How are you?
Also well.
And joining us via Zoom today, Senator David Van. David, welcome to the show.
G'day, Sean. How are you?
Where are you geographically?
I am in Melbourne.
And that is home, born and bred Victorian boy, right?
Completely, yeah. Born in the very centre of Melbourne at St Vincent's, but grew up down Bayside.
Brilliant. Could we start there so people can understand a little bit more about your upbringing and what got you to where you are now? How did growing up look Bayside?
Oh, fantastic. It was boy's own adventure kind of life. So, always been a lover of the sea and the beach, so that was not far away. Had all the well-known golf courses very close to home, so we had all that parkland to roam through, ride our bikes through, and creating little jumps and pretending we were BMXs before BMX even existed as a product. So it was a
Interestingly, so you graduated school and went into a fascinating undergrad degree in horticulture. Was that the professional path that you thought you might start in? Because it didn't actually end up that way, did it?
No, you could say that. The thinking there was I was originally thinking to become a landscape architect, and I got the marks to get into RMIT, but I didn't have a design background. So they suggested I go to Burnley, do some of that and do some design work on the side, and then come back the following year. I really enjoyed that first year, horticulture. And when I went back to them and said, listen, if I complete, at that stage it was a 3-year diploma, and if I finish that, what would they give me as credit for the degree course? And they said, well, you'd only have to do 2 years. So either way, it was 5 years I was looking at. So I finished off that degree, but halfway through, they changed it from a 3-year diploma to a 4.5-year degree. So after I was done with that, I was done studying for a while. So I went from there. Became a ski instructor. So I spent 3 years as a ski instructor. This is a very linear path you'll see in my career. And so I spent 3 years both here and overseas, in Austria and the States, as a ski instructor. And then when I thought time to get a real job, one of the things that the horticulture course had in it was it had 3 streams. It had your major, so mine was landscape design. It had the science subjects, but it also had a business stream, so marketing and accounting. I sucked at the accounting bit, but I topped the marketing course most of the way through. So it was when it came time to think about a new career, what I was going to do, marketing sort of loomed very large. And so from marketing, I went into public relations, public affairs. That got me close to government, saw all the good work that gets done by elected people, and thought, well, there's a path.
Before we drop into political office, and we'll get to your postgrad degrees, your postgraduate work in a little while, which are certainly more relevant to what you're doing now, but what's the transferability of an undergraduate degree in horticulture, being a ski instructor, public relations to a lesser extent? There's probably an understandable link there. But what have you taken out of those 3 pre-politics experiences that absolutely can be applied in your life now?
Yeah, certainly they can. The horticulture was effectively a science degree. So, I learned the discipline of science, of looking for evidence and the strength of research, and academia in general. You can learn so much just from the academic record. Everyone uses Google to look for answers for things. I tend to use Google Scholar, and then I'll go to the base research and find answers that way. So it really helps in my life that way. The ski instructor bit, I guess, if anything, it sort of brought me out of myself. It gave me the confidence in front of people to be able to just be myself and to be able to communicate, because when you're working in a foreign country like Austria, you have to be able to communicate whether you can speak the language or not. So it became a lot of fun trying to come up with different ways to teach people when you couldn't speak to them. Not that many of our clients were non-English speaking. It's the reason the Austrians hired us in the first place, but occasionally it would happen. But that was a lot of fun. But also, the pedagogical side of ski instructing, understanding what learning is, how people learn, how different people learn in different ways. It taught me a lot from that point of view as well.
There's some interesting views on specialisation versus generalisation. A wonderful book called Range by David Epstein, which talks more in the sporting domain, but says we lose a trick if we specialise too early. And it seems a lot of our academic and even our professional lives, people are rushing to specialise. Do you have a view on that, given the non-linearity of your particular background?
It's certainly a path. It means you get to things later in life. I got to politics probably later than I would have hoped to. But it does broaden your mind, does broaden how you approach problems. And certainly for me, I see really my only one real true skill that I have is problem solving. So for me, that background was invaluable in being able to learn that skill.
What was it about the lure of politics? I mean, you talked about your life in the PR firm as bringing you closer to politics, but specifically, what was it that captured your attention and made you really want to be a politician?
I was never one of those people who always wanted to be a politician. What drew me to it was something that you two guys would understand, and that's service. I could see a path that where I could serve my country in a different way to how you did, but just as meaningfully. And it was that being watching people, getting close to seeing how people were actually serving their country and how they do serve their country in parliaments. I'll use the plural, state and federal. That really drew me to it.
And we've never asked this question of any of our guests who are politicians, but how do you get into politics? What was the path that, when you stepped out of the PR firm, how do you enter into a political career?
Well, it was, I joined the Liberal Party in 2013, and it was just being of service within the party structure, making, always putting my hand up to do the tasks that no one else wanted to do. That gets you known around the party as a doer or someone who is of service. And that stands you in good stead when you put your hand up for pre-selection. And that's what happened with me. I was recognised for the work I'd done for the party, and I won pre-selection in a field of 6 people, and then ended up winning the 3rd spot on the ticket in the 2019 federal election, one which no one thought we would ever win.
Why don't you just wait here at the bar while I go outside and go around the corner and get our car? We'll leave this old town behind, buy some beers, drive down south till dawn. Or we can cruise down along the coast, maybe park down by the swell. Tune into the big US radio, 18 million. The party's gone too far this time.
Most recently, you've captured the nation's attention by your trip into the Ukraine. You're the chair of the Parliamentary Friends of Ukraine. Maybe an opening question, why did you feel it necessary to visit Ukraine?
It was more a question of how could I not go there. It was, I was chair of that Parliamentary Friends group for the whole 3 years so far that I've been in Parliament. And under the previous ambassador, or he always wanted me to go, but the talks were about trade and visas and those sorts of things. And then he left. He finished his term, and then the Russians started building up on the border, and I was working with their deputy head of mission on that issue. And there was a plan at one stage for me to go in earlier this year to be a witness to the build-up. Then the invasion actually happened the week that I was meant to be going in. So it got postponed until after the election. And the other week was the first real opportunity that I'd had post-election to be able to get in there. So it was an incredibly important thing for me to do personally. And I think on behalf of all Australians, to go in there and tell the Ukrainians that they're not on their own, that the rest of the world is watching. We do care what's happening to them. And so I did a lot of media over there, obviously a lot of it via translation, but there's, I just wanted to get that message out to them, but then also being able to show Australians that we need to continue to care about Ukraine and what's happening there. And so going down into the Donbass to see our Bushmasters in action, to talk to the troops that are using them, and to really understand what's happening on the ground, why they're needed, how they're being used, talking through different ways that they could be using them, what other weapons and or material they need, to continue this fight. And so be able to come back and talk to people about that and really push hard for them to continue to receive support, not just from Australia, but from other countries around the world.
We obviously have a background in uniform and have seen, I guess, the military aspects of, international relations and foreign policy manifested on a tactical sort of sense. And clearly there's that relationship. I'm really interested in your reflections, sort of moving to the front line, both from a political and a personal perspective, in terms of what you saw there and how you saw, I guess, political decisions or diplomatic decisions translating in a very human context.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. In Kiev itself, life is going on as per normal. It's a beautiful, lovely European city, and it was summer when I was there, so everyone's out and about. But everyone was saying how quiet it was because it's only about a third of the population still there. People have either fled or serving. But life is pretty normal. I didn't even hear one air raid siren the whole time I was in Kiev. But was important to go and meet with fellow parliamentarians, plus their ministers, foreign affairs and defence ministers, and really understand what's going on. Also got to meet with some of their defence industry, which was very, very interesting as well.
Many years ago, we left the word battlefield behind and we started talking about battle spaces, and Ukraine's a great example of a battle space where communities are drawn into conflict, where there isn't easily distinguishable lines between, those people who are carrying arms and those who are not. At street level, could you pass comment on the resolve of the Ukrainian people? What did it look like, in the streets and in the neighbourhoods?
Yeah, it's certainly in Kiev, like every taxi driver, every barman, every barista, would say they were just waiting for their call up, that they're ready, willing and able to go and serve. The amount of passion for this fight within the Ukrainians is beyond reproach. It is stark, it is strong, it is visible, it is palpable. You see it everywhere. The street art through Kiev is all about, I'm not sure what your PG rating is on this, so I won't necessarily quote I won't exactly quote the soldiers on Snake Island, but I'm sure most people have heard that saying. And then as you move forward into the, I guess you'd call it the theatre of operations, rather than the battlefield. And the meeting the soldiers personally, they are steely-eyed, they are strong, they are just ready and up for this fight, as long as we keep on giving them the weapons to fight with.
Linked question to the resolve of the people. Putin expected this to be over quickly, for the conflict to fall in the favour of the Russians in short order. That hasn't been the case. Staying nearly with the street level view, is the conflict winnable or is the conflict loseable?
It's definitely loseable. You will hear the Ukrainians at all levels say this. If Russia stops fighting, then the war will stop. If Ukrainians stop fighting, then Ukraine will be stopped. So they see it as existential. They're not prepared to stop fighting. As long as we keep on giving them the weapons to fight with, they will continue to fight. Of that I have no doubt.
It's interesting. We get Clausewitz drummed into us as young military officers, and he famously said war is an extension of politics by another means. I'd argue, I guess, from my relative myopic military view, that we've had a fair bit of war and probably not a lot of politics in that grand strategy sense, and a lot of focus on sort of being able to win the tactical fight, which we did in Vietnam, we did in Iraq, we did in Afghanistan, and yet didn't have that sort of ultimate strategic victory. I'm interested in your thoughts about, and we'll talk about the region in a second, but about the nature of sort of the strategic drivers for recent conflicts, and potentially the overemphasis on the military side. I mean, that is only one component, even if I imagine the Ukrainians are able to get their weapons, push back a Russian assault. The problem doesn't just go away, does it?
No, it doesn't. And, as the Ukrainians will tell you, and this war's been going on for over 8 years now. This war didn't start February 24. So this problem has been, as you say, it's been an ongoing problem. And unless Russia is defeated in this war and pushed out of all of Ukrainian territory, the war will likely just continue on. There may be a stalemate, there may be a ceasefire, maybe even a peace agreement, but you can rest assured that Russia won't stop until it's annexed all of Ukraine, or at least as much of it as it sees fit to, which I would believe would include Kiev.
And so on top of, I guess, the military problem that we're facing here, there's clearly a statecraft and a political problem. Above that, you've been quite critical of France and Germany, again, mainly on the military side. But do you see there's a requirement at that strategic and political level throughout Europe and indeed the world to be doing more than just the weapons in the Ukraine situation?
Certainly there is a lot more that needs to be done. And I'm certainly on the statecraft side of things, I'm not critical of France at all. I think President Macron has done quite a good job of at that diplomatic statecraft level. So I think he should be applauded for that bit of it. The bit that I was critical about was not providing sufficient weapons, and probably more aimed at Germany than France. You know, they have thousands of version 1 Leopard tanks sitting in warehouses that could easily, be taken through into Ukraine. So I think at that statecraft level, there is the sanctions are obviously biting in Russia now. I think there's more that can be done there. I think there really needs to be more political will in Europe to be prepared to turn off the Russian gas. The Russians are doing it to them anyway. Again, this weekend they're turning it off. So there is this problem goes well beyond Ukraine. I think the unwillingness to or the fear of escalation is misplaced. I think there is a very good chance that regardless of whatever Europe or NATO does, Russia could escalate to a nuclear level quite readily. And we're seeing that in Zaporizhzhia now with the shelling of the nuclear power station. One sec. Your listeners might not be aware, but Ukraine has, I think it's either 15 or 16 nuclear reactors, including the one in Zaporizhzhia, which is the largest in Europe. And it would only take one missile to hit one of those, or probably a couple of missiles, to be honest. And then you've got a nuclear problem, that's not made from a nuclear warhead. So I think the risk of nuclear escalation is real, regardless of what the West does. I think what I've said many times is, getting in and helping now keeps the fight and the escalation probably on Ukraine territory rather than spreading to other NATO territory. So, deterrence is deterrence, whether it's conventional or nuclear. If you're not prepared to show how credible your deterrence is, you're not going to deter an enemy. So, I think statecraft can only go so far. Showing a willingness to provide weapons is truly the only way that this war can be won by Ukraine. And to be honest, it has to be won by Ukraine because I don't think anyone believes for a second that Putin will stop at the border of Ukraine. And there's many other states, NATO states, that will be at risk. And so I think getting in sooner rather than later is critically important.
Turning from Europe into our region, you wrote a very prescient article in early February, about 2 weeks before this invasion on the 24th, drawing parallels between the situation in Russia and the Ukraine and China's view of Taiwan, and saying that a Russian invasion, which ultimately ended up happening, could serve as a really dangerous precedent for Xi. What should Australia be doing here? So you've mentioned that we need to have that consideration of a strong deterrent presence as we potentially see an escalation towards more martial activity directed towards Taiwan. What can or should Australia be doing to try and stop that before it does escalate?
Again, I think this is not something Australia can do on its own. This is a global problem. And certainly Australia and like-minded countries are the ones that need to be showing that there is a strong will to push back against any sort of aggression. And so we have the opportunity to do that in Ukraine, and that sends, I think, a very powerful signal to Xi or any other aggressors, whether it be the North Koreans, the Iranians, that the like-minded countries are willing to stand up to them, are willing to do what is necessary to make sure that they don't benefit from aggression. And so, I think the Ukraine still serves as that example. I don't know, my reading of Xi is that he's a lot more rational than Putin is. So I think he would be seeing how strongly united and how far some countries have come. Just look at Sweden, Finland, etc., signing up to NATO. Germany increasing its defence spending. They would be very worrying signs, I would have thought, for President Xi.
Mm. And from an Australian perspective, do you think, given, I guess, the real interthatched trade relationships, you mentioned sanctions before, and certainly countries like Germany did sting from the Russian gas. But do you think that Australia could successfully enact a range of sanctions as strict as what's been imposed on the Ukraine without it being some form of Pyrrhic victory, without it sort of destroying our own economy?
And that's a really good question. That's a really hard one. No, we are too reliant on China, but that's changing. You're seeing a lot of signals around that, not for necessarily decoupling, but certainly diverging. I was at an institute just this morning talking about these issues, and you're seeing certainly Australian businesses diversify their markets, are working very hard at trying to find new markets, not necessarily walking away from China. But so in the short term, no, I don't think we could survive. I think it would be, as you say, a Pyrrhic victory. And it would do massive damage to the Australian economy. But we've got to be prepared for that, because if China invades Taiwan, we won't have any say in that. And as soon as that happens, well, I'm pretty sure trade just stops regardless. So if we're not prepared to show that we're up for the fight and that we will stand up for ourselves and for other liberal democracies, then that gives Xi all the when he's making his calculations, that gives him a lot of comfort or wouldn't give him a lot of comfort, knowing that the coalition of the willing, it's the right term, are ready to stand up to him.
Was China looks into our backyard, are they thinking we're doing enough? I mean, in the ABC article where you throw down to France and Germany and say, quote, get off your asses after you visit Ukraine, in the next breath, ABC quotes you as saying, Australia should open its embassy in the Ukraine, and you've run past the Australian embassy, and it's quite fine. The Canadians are back in the building, so why aren't we there? So to the point, are we demonstrating enough resolve in the Ukrainian theatre for the Chinese to really pay attention and think they would be serious?
Great point raising about our embassy, and I'm certainly going to have a lot more to say about that next week in Parliament. It's such an easy thing. I met with our ambassador. He briefed me going in, and I debriefed him going out of country. And as you say, I went for my morning run. I ran past the embassy deliberately. I took a photo and I sent it to him. I said, "Still here, mate. Why don't we put a flag up?" And he laughed and said, "Would love to." So all these things show resolve. So it's no one thing that we should be doing. You've got to bring together all these elements and show resolve. And opening the embassy is just one of those things. Sending more Bushmasters, lots more of them, again shows resolve. You're looking at whatever other munitions that we could be sending. speaking up, to other countries, and whether it be France, Germany, there's lots of others, that can and should be doing more. I'd love to see some fighter jets going into Ukraine. Now, I don't care if they're F-15s, 16s, Typhoons, Griffins, whatever. The West has plenty of fighter jets that they could be putting into that fight, and having that air defence would show some serious resolve on behalf of the liberal democracies, and would really change the fault lines on the war as they lie right now.
Mm. If we could go just a little macro for a second, there's a wonderful Churchill quote that, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the other ones we've tried. And certainly, I don't think any of us would want to live in a system other than a liberal democracy. And yet, when we look at, I guess, the strategic horizon of countries like Russia and China that aren't limited by a 4-year sort of electoral cycle, that don't necessarily have the same sort of domestic focus that we tend to see with democracies. When we look at that kind of, I guess, what that gives you in a geopolitical sense, and concurrently when we look at some of the things that democracy is turning up, the kind of Trump era in the States, and we saw, the sort of Dutertes in the Philippines, and we saw, Wilder almost getting elected in the Netherlands, and Le Pen in France. There's clearly, as Churchill said, there's issues with democracy. Do you think it is sustainable? Do you think that as a system of government, it's going to be able to rally against these kind of big emerging sort of authoritarian regimes like Russia and China in a strategic sense?
Yeah, I truly do. I'd be optimistic and say I can't see, short of an existential wipeout. I can't see how those authoritarian regimes, can win over democracy. People's free will, their freedom to choose, their ability to make decisions for themselves is too important for people. Now, autocratic nations like North Korea, China, etc., where people haven't seen what that looks and feels like for decades, if not centuries, it's really hard to explain to them what they're missing out on. But I think those of us that have experienced the freedom of democracy, that even your one little bit, your one vote every 3 years actually means something. And as we've seen a change of government, so that only happens when people vote. Whether it was a good change of government or a bad change of government, people will judge again in another 3 years. But I think if anyone was to try and take that away from Australians or any other democracy, I think you'd see a pushback harder than anything else. Like we're seeing in Ukraine.
I mean, on our own politics, that one little vote multiplied by millions of times, the people did vote, and in many ways it was a vote of no confidence in the Liberal Party. Could you offer a comment on the state of the current Liberal Party as we run a health check on why the party didn't do so well at the last election?
Yeah, health check wise, I think we're doing really well. When I look around the party room, everyone's up for the fight. They know we lost. No one's sort of carrying away from it. When you look at Labor after the 2019 election, when I got to see them up close for the first time across the chamber, they were crestfallen. They were so demoralised. The Liberal Party or the coalition, it's not like that. I think I'm really proud of how my colleagues have all gone, right, that was the people's decision. We accept it. Now we're in opposition. We're up for this fight. We'll take it to them every step of the way.
There's a lot of labelling seemingly inside the Liberal Party, particularly factional labelling. You've been cited as being part of the centre-right faction. Are the factions helpful or necessary? Are they value-adding to people's perspective of the party?
Um, yeah, and I'm not sure that article was right. When the journalist called me, he said, "You're the last one on my list, and no one can tell me which camp you belong in." I said, "Well, you pick for yourself then."
Do you have to be part of a camp? Yeah.
Yeah, well, exactly. So yes, while I was put in that section, the factions aren't like certainly aren't like what they are in the Labor Party. Where you belong to one. Not everyone belongs to a faction in the coalition. Not everyone wants one. Sometimes they're helpful, from a career point of view. Sometimes they hurt you from a career point of view. And certainly in the Federal Party, it's not as strong as people make out or want to make out. They exist, but they're fluid. They're not the curse that everyone thinks that they might be.
Can we turn for a second to David Van, the human? We've been speaking a lot about David Van, the senator. Clearly a lot of pressure in the role you're in, a lot of sort of overt criticism and all that sort of stuff. There's immense sort of, importance in terms of the things you're dealing with as an elected representative. We've been really interested in the topic of resilience for the last few years. How do you keep going? What sort of things do you use to sort of keep your focus, keep you on track, to sort of de-stress, to keep you sane, fit and healthy?
Well, after running your own business for 15 years, I think you forget how to de-stress. So for me, it's I have two passions. One's a more recent one. But I've always been very keen on exercise. I grew up as a racing cyclist most of my life. My father was a racing cyclist before me. Always had a passion for cycling. Now I stopped racing 6 or 7 years ago, and now tend to do a bit more work in the gym than I do. It's a bit warmer than on winter mornings in Melbourne to be in the gym than it is to be out on the road.
Less traffic, less aggressive drivers.
Yeah, well, there's some big boys in the gym. You don't want to get in their way. Certainly not a little pipsqueak like me. So exercise is very important to me. And lately, after completing a Masters of International Relations, going back to study after so long away from it has also been of great help. It focuses the mind. It really does help me de-stress when I'm studying.
There's a really nice picture of you and Josh Frydenberg arm in arm on your Instagram. Was he unlucky in this last political round? Could you offer comment on Josh, his politics, him as a person?
Unlucky doesn't go halfway to describing it. He's a wonderful man. He's truly one of the best human beings you'll ever possibly meet. I saw him briefly last Sunday. Pardon me. As a politician, you would never know which faction Josh was in. He was friends with everyone, enemy of no one. From a policy wonk point of view, as smart as a whip, got it, knew what the country needed, but was humble enough and is humble enough to always reach out to colleagues and ask for their opinion as well. Just a marvellous politician, a loss to the parliament, and I hope one day he's returned.
Mm-hmm. What about mentors? Who would you call amongst your mentors, past or present?
That's a good question. Sadly, I don't know for what reason I've not had a lot of them, or any constant state ones. People have come in and out of my life and given guidance, along the way. So I can't say I had any one mentor. I've got some great people. A mate of mine, George, who will no doubt listen to this, has been a great help to me recently. There's some really good people out there. But also, I read a lot, so get a lot of guidance from that. As I said, studying, doing a second master's at the moment. I get a lot of input, certainly for my work, and I found both masters are dovetailing in with my political work very closely, because I spend so much time in the foreign affairs, defence and trade space, as well as, I should say, my other two policy pillars are energy and environment. So it's kind of like the breadth, the 5 policy pillars I look at. But I'm currently doing a Masters of Strategy and Security at ADFA through the University of New South Wales. So it's fascinating.
Our listeners are always thirsty for reading recommendations. Have you read anything good lately? And as a bonus, do you read fiction? I sort of am a bit of a fan of literature, fiction. Anything in the fiction space, maybe?
No, nothing in the fiction space. I just don't have time. Certainly while I've been studying. Two very quick recommendations. One is Jim Molan's latest book. That is well worth the read. He's come up with some stuff there. I'm looking forward to debating him on some of it over a beer in coming weeks. The other one is Rory Medcalf's book on the Indo-Pacific. I think that's a must-read, going back to what we were talking about earlier. I read his and Jeff Raby's books one after the other, so I could do a side-by-side comparison, and that the intellectual heft of Rory versus Jeff was quite outstanding. So there is those. I'm also a big fan of podcasts. So obviously there's a lot on at the moment, touching on Ukraine plus issues with the War on the Rocks podcast. Sorry to take it. I don't want to take any listeners away from yours, but that's a great podcast to keep an eye on. A lot of the CSIS podcasts I find are really quite good, particularly on the China and Indo-Pacific issues. So anything I can get where I can get input on either what's going on in the Indo-Pacific or Ukraine, I'm very thirsty for.
Mm-hmm. What about your power song? We often ask our guests what is their power song, when you need to move that 120 kilos off the bench, or in your case, maybe a little bit heavier than 120 kilos. What's the song that you would be playing to just give you that extra inspiration, motivation?
Easy one. David Bowie, Young Americans.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah.
It's always been a big Bowie fan. But yeah, just the both I don't know, not so much the lyrics, but just some of those where it really lifts towards the end. I get a big pump out of that.
I was just going to say we have shared our power songs. Tim's a Jimmy Barnes fan, and mine was a Moby song for a long time. Although I watched that Elvis movie, in fact, Tim and I watched it in the UK recently, and rediscovered some of his stuff. And there's a version of Burning Love with the London Philharmonic Orchestra, and you talk about lifting. It's just this amazing, you can almost feel the sort of, I don't know, the young violinist in the 60s who's used to playing, I don't know, Chopin or whatever, and suddenly playing Elvis. It's a brilliant track.
Yeah, it's like Neil Diamond's Crunchy Granola Sweet.
The Hot August Night.
The Hot August Night, and the crescendo, at the end of as the orchestra builds up. Often put that on at dinner parties, after when you maybe having a cognac at the end of it, and people go, "Oh, what's what are we listening to now? Then they get it, and by the end of the song, everyone's dancing on the seat or on the table. It's a ripper.
Probably not one for the dinner party, but one that I find particularly inspiring has no lyrics, the 1812 Overture. I mean, that is just a ripper piece of music that culminates like no other piece of music.
It truly, truly does. And, having just been in Ukraine, for that not far from where that fight took place, the thought of listening to it did cross my mind while I was driving down to the Donbass.
Have you been to India? 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 Well, you better get some of it, India. Have you been to India? There's shit that will blow your
Yeah. What's next? Political aspirations, personal achievements or endeavours, meaningful challenges. What's next for you, David?
Yeah, well, politics as usual for the foreseeable future. If the right job opportunity came up sort of at the end of the term, to go do something meaningful, I would look at that. I wouldn't mind spending more time, in a commercial setting. But it would need to have that international perspective for me, to attract me to that. Certainly working on the second masters at the moment, as I said, but also got in the back of my mind, am I doing this, or do I really want to just do a PhD? So my master's thesis was on multilateralism in the Indo-Pacific, and I could see that being turned into a PhD pretty easely. So, well, not easily, with a lot of work.
Yes.
I've got the direction of where I want to go. I know where I need to go, ask the questions and look at do the research. So, that's another possibility that might come along.
Well, it certainly sounds like you will be continuing to fill your unforgiving minutes with some pretty quality distance run. Senator David Van, thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, gents. It's been a great hour talking to you. Really enjoyed it. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Now to the debrief. We try to go always a little further in this podcast and greatly appreciate your input. Please let us know your feedback, the good, the bad, or the ugly. Also, if you know someone who is living a life less ordinary, we'd love to hear about them. You can get in touch at debrief@unforgiving60.com. That's debrief@unforgiving60.com. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please tell your friends and write a review for us on Apple Podcasts. Until next episode, keep filling your unforgiving minutes with 60 seconds worth of distance run. See you next time on the Unforgiving 60.